Hello and welcome to History Sleep Stories. Night settled gently over the fields of northeastern France, folding the village of Domrémy into a quiet that felt older than memory itself. The sky was deep and untroubled, the kind of darkness that did not threaten, but comforted. In this small place, far from courts and battlefields, life moved at a rhythm shaped by seasons rather than ambition. Fires dimmed behind wooden doors, animals shifted softly in their pens, and the earth seemed to breathe in slow, patient cycles, as though nothing of great consequence could ever disturb it. Domrémy was not a village meant for history. As you settle in to listen to this sleep story, a like and a subscription are a quiet way to support this channel. And if you feel comfortable, you're warmly invited to share where you're listening from in the comments. It was a place of paths worn smooth by repetition, of hands calloused by honest labor, of bells that marked time not with urgency, but reassurance. Days began with light touching the fields and ended with prayers whispered more from habit than fear. Here, people expected tomorrow to resemble yesterday, and found comfort in that certainty. In such stillness, imagination had little reason to wander toward destiny. Within this calm lived a young girl named Joan of Arc, though no one spoke her name with reverence then. She rose with the sun, helped with chores, listened more than she spoke. Her world was small and familiar, framed by grazing land, a simple church, and the protective presence of family. If there was anything remarkable about her, it was how unremarkable she seemed. She did not seek attention, nor did she stand apart in ways that demanded notice. Yet even in ordinary lives, silence has layers. Beneath the surface calm of Domrémy lay a country in distress, though its echoes reached the village only faintly. News traveled slowly, softened by distance and routine, and so fear arrived dulled, like a distant storm seen but not felt. This distance allowed peace to survive here longer than elsewhere, creating a fragile bubble where innocence could linger. Joan moved through this world with a quiet attentiveness, absorbing its sounds and pauses. The wind through the trees, the rhythm of footsteps on packed earth, the hush that followed evening prayers, all of it seemed to matter to her. Where others accepted stillness as empty, she treated it as something full, as though meaning might one day rise gently from it. Nothing in her life yet demanded courage beyond the small bravery of daily work, yet something unseen was already taking shape. Great destinies, it is often said, begin in moments that appear insignificant. Not with thunder, but with silence. Not with commands, but with listening. Domrémy offered no signs, no omens carved into the sky, only the steady reassurance of sameness. And yet, within that sameness, a question quietly waited, unanswered and unformed, like a door not yet noticed. As night deepened, the village surrendered fully to rest. Lamps faded, voices hushed, and the world narrowed to breath and darkness. Joan, like everyone else, lay down expecting another ordinary morning. She could not have known that this calm was not permanent, that peace sometimes exists only to sharpen the contrast of what follows. For now, there was only quiet, and within that quiet, the faint beginning of something that had not yet learned how to speak. Beyond the gentle quiet of Domrémy, the wider land of France lived under a very different sky. While villages like Joan's slept wrapped in routine, the kingdom itself did not rest. It existed in a long state of waiting, suspended between what had been lost and what had not yet been reclaimed. This was an age shaped by the 100 Years' War, a conflict so drawn out that it no longer felt like a single struggle, but like the natural condition of the world. For decades, borders had shifted like uneasy shadows. English forces occupied large parts of the land, not always with visible violence, but with presence alone. Their banners marked towns, their authority reshaped daily life, and their rule reminded people that power no longer belonged where it once had. For ordinary men and women, this did not mean constant battle, but constant uncertainty. Each season carried the same question: who would rule tomorrow, and at what cost? The weight of war settled most heavily not in moments of combat, but in the long spaces between them. Fields were planted with hesitation. Trade routes grew unreliable. Taxes multiplied, demanded by rival claimants who each insisted on legitimacy. Nobles argued, alliances fractured, and the crown itself seemed distant and unsure. Leadership was spoken of in hushed, disappointed tones, as if hope had learned to be careful. This uncertainty bred exhaustion rather than outrage. People grew tired of choosing sides, tired of promises made and broken, tired of hearing that relief was coming soon. War, when stretched across generations, loses its drama and becomes background noise, an ever-present strain that dulls rather than shocks. Children were born into it, learned its rhythms, and carried its weight without ever knowing another way. Faith, once a source of clarity, became complicated. Churches remained full, prayers continued, but doubt crept quietly alongside belief. Why would God allow such division to endure so long? Why did victory always seem to belong to someone else? These questions were rarely spoken aloud, yet they lingered in the silence after sermons, in the pauses before sleep, in the spaces where certainty used to live. Even so, the longing for peace never disappeared. It softened rather than hardened, becoming less a demand and more a quiet ache. People did not dream of triumph anymore, they dreamed of stability. Of knowing who governed their land. Of waking without fear of new demands or sudden change. Peace became something imagined in simple terms, like a return to ordinary days. News traveled slowly, and by the time it reached distant villages, it arrived stripped of urgency. Stories of loss sounded like echoes rather than alarms. This distance allowed places like Domrémy to remain outwardly calm, but it did not fully protect them. The knowledge that the wider world was fractured pressed gently but persistently on the edges of daily life, like a shadow that lengthened without ever crossing the threshold. It was into this atmosphere that Joan was growing, even if she did not yet understand it. The tension shaping the kingdom had not shaped her directly, but it existed all the same, waiting. History often moves this way, quietly preparing its stage while its future players remain unaware. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, as though something unexpected was required to break the long stalemate. What France needed was not merely strength, but meaning. Not another army, but a reason to believe again. Such things rarely announce themselves loudly. More often, they emerge from unlikely places, carried by individuals who do not yet know the weight they are about to bear. And so, while the kingdom endured its shadowed uncertainty, a young girl in a quiet village remained untouched by its demands, unaware that the unrest of the land was slowly, inevitably, turning its gaze toward her. As the wider kingdom endured its long uncertainty, life in Domrémy continued to unfold at a gentler pace, shaped less by politics and more by habit. Within this quiet rhythm, Joan's childhood passed without ceremony, marked by the same routines that guided every other child in the village. She rose early, helped tend animals, carried water, spun wool, and learned the unremarkable skills expected of her. Nothing about these tasks hinted at destiny. They were simple, grounding, and endlessly repeated, and she performed them without complaint. In many ways, she was like the others. She laughed when laughter came easily, listened to stories told by elders, and knew the comfort of familiar faces. There was no hunger for distinction in her, no desire to be seen as different. If anything, she blended into the fabric of village life, another presence moving through days defined by work and prayer. This ordinariness is important, because it made what followed all the more unexpected. Yet there was a quiet quality to her that some noticed only in hindsight. Joan seemed especially attentive to moments others dismissed. Where children rushed through chores, she lingered. Where voices filled the air, she listened for what remained unsaid. Silence did not make her restless, it seemed to settle her. In the still hours, when the village slowed and sound softened, she appeared most at ease, as though those pauses offered something essential. Faith was woven naturally into her days, not as a burden, but as a presence. She attended church regularly, not out of fear, but familiarity. The rituals, the candles, the soft echoes of prayer felt steady and reassuring. Religion in Domrémy was not dramatic or forceful, it was gentle, habitual, and communal. For Joan, belief did not demand explanation. It existed quietly, much like the land itself. There were no signs then that set her apart in obvious ways. She did not speak of visions, nor claim special understanding. Her piety was simple, expressed through consistency rather than display. She prayed as others prayed, worked as others worked, and lived within the same limits imposed on every young girl of her time. If destiny was already near, it did not disturb the surface of her life. What did distinguish her, subtly, was an inward stillness. Even in motion, she carried a sense of calm focus, as though her attention rested slightly deeper than her surroundings. This was not withdrawal, but presence. She noticed small changes in light, shifts in mood, moments when the world seemed to pause. Such awareness did not yet have meaning, but it shaped her way of being. Children often reflect the anxieties of their environment, yet Joan seemed sheltered from the wider fear pressing upon the kingdom. Not because she was unaware, but because that fear had not yet found a place within her. The war remained distant, abstract, something spoken of rather than experienced. This distance allowed her inner world to develop untouched by urgency, giving her space to grow into herself before being asked to grow beyond it. In the evenings, when work ended and voices softened, Joan often sat quietly, content to be still. These moments were not empty. They were filled with thought, observation, and a sense of waiting she could not have named. It was as though her life was gathering something slowly, without her knowing what it would be used for. Such moments rarely draw attention, yet they shape character more deeply than action. Those who remembered her later would struggle to pinpoint when she became different, because the change was not sudden. It was rooted in these early years, in the patience learned through routine, in the humility shaped by anonymity, in the comfort found within silence. Her childhood did not prepare her for glory, but for listening, and that skill would prove far more important than strength. As Joan grew, the contrast between her inner calm and the unrest beyond Domrémy quietly widened. The land was restless, searching for resolution, while she remained steady, grounded in the present. History often moves toward those who are ready to receive it, not those who demand it. And so, while nothing yet disturbed her days, the stillness she carried was already making room for something that would soon arrive, not with force, but with a voice meant only for her. The stillness that had shaped Joan's childhood did not vanish as she grew older, instead, it deepened. The quiet she carried within her became more attentive, more watchful, as though it were slowly turning towards something unseen. Life in Domrémy continued much as it always had, marked by work, prayer, and repetition, yet beneath this familiarity, her sense of waiting became more pronounced. It was not anxious, nor urgent, but patient, like the pause before dawn when the world seems to hold its breath. It was during one such ordinary moment that the first change occurred. There was no dramatic setting, no crowd, no sign that would have startled the village from its routine. Joan was young, alone, and engaged in the simple movements of daily life when she became aware of something different. At first, it was not a voice, but a presence, gentle and unexpected, arriving not from outside her world, but from within its quiet spaces. She would later describe light before sound, a clarity that felt distinct from imagination yet free of fear. It did not interrupt her life so much as slip into it, as softly as dusk entering a room. The experience did not command attention, it invited it. There was no threat in it, no urgency that demanded immediate action. Instead, it carried a calm authority that felt familiar, as though it had always been waiting for her to notice. Joan did not rush to explain what she experienced. She did not run to others with questions or declarations. Silence, which had always been her companion, remained her refuge. She listened. In that listening, the presence seemed to shape itself into words, not spoken aloud, but understood with unmistakable clarity. These were not the voices of confusion or fear, they were steady, composed, and precise, carrying a tone that asked for trust rather than obedience. What unsettled her was not terror, but awe. The experience did not overwhelm her senses, nor did it break the rhythm of her days. Instead, it gently reframed them. Tasks continued, prayers were said, sleep came as usual, yet something had shifted. The world now seemed layered, as though the familiar surface concealed a deeper dimension that had briefly revealed itself. She questioned herself quietly. Was this imagination? Fatigue? A test of faith? Such doubts did not frighten her, but they did slow her response. Joan had been shaped by humility, and humility taught caution. She did not assume importance or special favor. If anything, she felt smaller beneath the weight of what she sensed, aware that such experiences were not given lightly. The voices returned, always with the same calm presence, never rushing, never forcing. They spoke of responsibility rather than reward, of service rather than glory. There was no promise of safety or honor, only an assurance that what was being asked mattered. This distinction was crucial. It removed any temptation toward pride and replaced it with quiet resolve. Faith, which had once been a steady background to her life, now felt closer, more immediate. The church bells she had heard all her life took on a deeper resonance. Prayer became less routine and more personal, not louder, but more attentive. Joan did not feel chosen in a way that elevated her above others. She felt addressed, as one might be addressed by a truth that cannot be ignored once recognized. Still, she remained outwardly unchanged. To those around her, she was the same girl, performing the same duties, speaking no more than before. This restraint was not secrecy born of fear, but respect for something she did not yet fully understand. Sacred experiences, she seemed to sense, required space before they could be spoken. What made this first call so powerful was its gentleness. It did not break into her life, it waited for her to make room. It did not explain everything, it offered direction without detail. The mystery was not something to solve, but something to live alongside. In this way, the call became a presence rather than an event, woven into her days as quietly as breath. As weeks passed, the stillness that had once shaped her childhood now revealed its purpose. Silence was no longer merely absence, it was the place where meaning gathered. Joan did not yet know where this path would lead, only that it had begun. Beyond Domrémy, the land remained restless, searching for relief it could not yet name. And within a young girl who had learned how to listen, a voice had found its way into the world, not to disturb the quiet, but to grow patiently within it. Even as the voices continued to guide her, Joan did not move forward with certainty. The presence she had begun to hear did not strip her of hesitation, it layered itself over the familiar rhythms of her days, and within that layering emerged doubt. She questioned herself quietly, in ways that no one else could perceive, wondering if what she sensed was real or merely a product of imagination. These thoughts were not sudden or dramatic, they were subtle, lingering like shadows in the corners of her mind. She feared being mistaken, not out of vanity, but from a sense of responsibility that weighed more heavily than any personal ambition. To act on what she had heard could have consequences she could not yet understand. Could a girl from a small village truly be the messenger of anything meaningful? The question was not rhetorical, it visited her often, pressing gently against her resolve. She considered what it might mean to fail, to misunderstand, or to be dismissed, and the possibility was enough to slow her heart, though it never stopped her. In those quiet moments, Joan's humility shaped her hesitation. She was taught to respect order, to heed the counsel of elders, and to live within the limits of her world. Nothing in her upbringing had prepared her for the extraordinary path she might follow, and so obedience became a natural companion to her fear. She followed the rhythms of the village, completing daily chores and attending prayers, all while wrestling privately with the sensations and messages that called to her. Action seemed premature, yet inaction felt incomplete. Doubt was not simply internal, it existed in the contrast between what she experienced and the ordinariness surrounding her. Life in Domrémy pressed her toward normalcy, toward the safe routines that demanded nothing more than care and attention. The fields, the animals, the family home, these were tangible and comprehensible. The presence she had begun to hear, however, was intangible, untested, and charged with unseen authority. The juxtaposition of ordinary life and extraordinary guidance created a tension she could neither ignore nor fully embrace. Fear, though subtle, sometimes edged into her dreams. In slumber, she glimpsed scenes that suggested failure or misunderstanding, though they were never vivid enough to frighten. Instead, they left impressions, faint lines of unease that prompted thought and reflection upon waking. Yet even these moments carried reassurance, for they reminded her that the path she sensed was not imposed by force but offered as possibility. She could choose to respond or to wait, the guidance was patient, allowing for hesitation without condemnation. Joan's internal struggle was further complicated by the natural desire to belong. Among her peers and family, she was still the girl they had always known. They expected routine, predictability, and compliance with the rhythms of village life. To act on what she heard might set her apart in ways that could be misunderstood or criticized. The fear of judgment, combined with the weight of responsibility, created a careful deliberation. She learned to carry both guidance and hesitation in tandem, holding them with quiet balance. Yet within this tension, a sense of moral clarity began to emerge. She understood, at least in small measures, that obedience to something greater than herself did not require immediate action. Listening carefully, evaluating quietly, and considering consequences, all of these were part of the process. Her fear did not silence her entirely, it moderated her responses, giving each step a deliberate quality. Even uncertainty could be honorable if approached with humility. At times, the voices themselves seemed to acknowledge her hesitation. There was no reproach, no sharp correction, only persistent, gentle encouragement. This subtle interaction fostered trust, allowing her to navigate doubt without succumbing to paralysis. She learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to continue forward despite it. In her ordinary tasks, she practiced patience, cultivating resilience that would be necessary when the world beyond Domrémy began to press in more insistently. By carrying doubt alongside guidance, Joan became more human to herself and, eventually, to history. Her story is not of instantaneous certainty or flawless execution, but of a young girl negotiating the weight of possibility within a familiar world. It is a story that resonates because anyone who has wrestled with responsibility, uncertainty, or fear can recognize a piece of themselves within her. The inner conflict, tempered by careful attention and quiet reflection, shapes a character that feels both extraordinary and entirely real. As her days continued, the rhythm of silence and reflection held her steady, even as questions persisted. She did not yet know when action would be required, nor did she know what form it would take. But within the interplay of doubt, fear, and obedience, the foundations of courage were being laid. And in this careful, deliberate waiting, the first hints of purpose began to crystallize, preparing her for the moment when the quiet of Domrémy would give way to the movement of destiny. The quiet deliberation that had filled Joan's days eventually arrived at a turning point. The presence that had guided her for months, or perhaps years, was no longer content to wait patiently in the background. It called for attention that could not be postponed, a direction that required movement beyond the familiar boundaries of Domrémy. The village, which had cradled her in routine and comfort, would soon become a memory rather than a refuge. The thought of leaving stirred a gentle melancholy within her, for home was more than a place, it was the sum of small, ordinary joys that gave life its steady rhythm. Joan's decision did not erupt suddenly or dramatically. It grew quietly, shaped by reflection, prayer, and the patient weighing of responsibility. She understood, with an instinctive clarity, that remaining in the village would confine her to ordinariness and limit the possibility that had begun to take shape within her. To leave was to step into uncertainty, to surrender the comforts of family and familiarity for a path that might never return her safely. In that understanding lay a courage both quiet and profound. Her family, who had known her only as the girl of the hearth and fields, experienced the news with a mixture of concern and incomprehension. They were protective, instinctively reluctant to release her into the unknown, yet they also recognized in her a seriousness that had matured beyond her years. Her father's brow creased with worry, not for what she might achieve, but for the dangers he could not see. Her mother's eyes, usually gentle and calm, held a subtle, aching hesitation. They had raised her in the rhythm of Domrémy, teaching her to follow orders, care for the household, and live within the bounds of safety. This choice disrupted all of that, and the emotional weight of their reactions pressed on Joan even as she understood them. The day of departure carried a quiet solemnity. There were no parades, no fanfare, only the measured steps of preparation and the lingering exchanges of farewell. She packed what was necessary, leaving behind the familiar implements of domestic life, yet carrying in her mind the sense of duty that had begun to take root. Every item left behind felt like a small concession to the life she had known, a tangible reminder that once she crossed the threshold, return would not be simple or guaranteed. As she moved toward the edge of the village, the sun fell low, casting long shadows across the fields that had shaped her childhood. The familiar smells of hay and earth, the soft sounds of animals settling for the night, and the distant toll of church bells became a poignant backdrop to her quiet courage. Each step forward was a measured negotiation between attachment and resolve, between sorrow and anticipation. It was not heroism in the conventional sense, it was an ordinary courage born of necessity, of recognition that some paths must be walked even when the heart longs to stay. Joan's inner life at this moment was marked by reflection. She recalled the years spent in observation, in small acts of kindness and diligence, in patient listening to voices both within and beyond herself. She understood, even in this early stage, that leaving home would be an initiation, a threshold between childhood and something larger than the life she had known. The sadness she felt was real, yet it coexisted with a sense of purpose that steadied her steps and softened fear. She was learning, in subtle ways, the balance between longing and duty, between attachment and the pursuit of calling. The villagers themselves observed her departure with quiet attention. Some nodded in respect, others lingered in sorrowful silence, and a few allowed themselves to offer whispered encouragements. These small gestures reinforced the sense that even in leaving, she remained connected to the life she had known. Her courage was not born of isolation, but of the acknowledgement and support of those she loved, even if they could not fully understand the path she was embarking upon. Night approached as Joan took her first steps away from Domrémy. The sky deepened into a familiar midnight hue, sprinkled with the faint glow of stars that had always hung above her home. In this twilight, the village seemed suspended between past and future, holding its breath as she moved forward. Every shadowed path and familiar landmark became imbued with both melancholy and meaning, a final meditation on what it meant to leave a world that had nurtured her quietly and patiently. Even as sadness lingered, there was a gentle anticipation in the air. The unknown did not intimidate her as much as it invited her attention. The landscape she had known remained etched in memory, yet the wider world promised possibilities she could not yet comprehend. Courage, she discovered, was not loud or boastful, it was a quiet readiness to step into what must be faced, even when it brings both loss and longing. In that balance, Joan carried herself forward, leaving behind the comfort of Domrémy while stepping into the subtle, inevitable motion of destiny. The road beyond Domrémy unfolded like a ribbon of uncertainty, winding through fields that shifted from familiar greens to landscapes Joan had never truly considered. Each step carried her further from the quiet security of her village, and yet the journey itself demanded neither haste nor recklessness. The paths were uneven, lined with hedgerows that whispered softly in the wind, and bordered by forests whose shadows deepened as the sun traced its slow arc across the sky. Travel, in this era, was measured not by urgency but by endurance, and Joan learned the rhythm of walking, resting, and moving again as the land itself dictated. The villages she passed were small, each with its own patterns of life, some quieter than Domrémy, others bustling with the muted energy of markets and craftsmen. Smoke curled from chimneys in the morning light, and the distant ringing of church bells marked hours that felt both foreign and familiar. Joan observed, noted, and absorbed. Each detail was catalogued quietly within her mind, the uneven cobblestones, the tilled fields, the small dogs that barked at travelers from walled courtyards. There was a kind of education in moving through these places, a slow immersion in the larger rhythms of the kingdom that her village had only hinted at. The journey brought her into closer proximity with the signs of the war she had heard of only in whispers. Armies were seldom visible on these roads, but the reminders of conflict appeared in subtler ways: a destroyed fence here, a vacant farmstead there, a bridge repaired hurriedly after some forgotten skirmish. These markers were not frightening, they were quiet suggestions that the world beyond Domrémy was vast, complex, and often unsettled. Joan's attention, trained by years of careful listening, noticed these shifts without becoming anxious. Each observation prepared her for the reality of the court and the people she would encounter there. As she traveled, the landscapes shifted gradually. Meadows gave way to rolling hills, which in turn gave way to the edges of dense forests. Streams crossed her path, sparkling under intermittent sunlight, offering both sustenance and a reminder of the small pleasures that persisted even in uncertain times. Birds moved overhead, their patterns measured and predictable, contrasting with the unpredictable course of human events she had left behind. These contrasts, the calm persistence of nature against the turbulence of human history, filled her with a quiet contemplation, a sense that patience and observation were as important as action. The pace of travel itself contributed to Joan's growing awareness. Walking for hours demanded a focus on the present, the weight of her pack, the feel of the ground beneath her feet, the rhythm of her own breath. Such repetitive attention was meditative, allowing her mind to expand and contract, dwelling on what had been left behind while anticipating what lay ahead. She thought of her family, of the familiar faces of Domrémy, and yet allowed herself to imagine the Dauphin, the uncertainty of his response, and the possibilities that awaited her. Each thought was a thread weaving together memory, present experience, and future expectation. Encounters along the way were rare, yet instructive. Travelers, merchants, and occasional soldiers passed her path with nods or quiet acknowledgement. Some offered advice, directions, or simple words of encouragement, and Joan received them with humility. She listened attentively to the stories and warnings of those who had moved through these roads before her. Each exchange reinforced the understanding that movement through the world required both attentiveness and discernment. Knowledge, like the footsteps she left behind, accumulated slowly but persistently, shaping the traveler as much as the destination itself. The weather added its own rhythm to the journey. Mist settled over valleys in the early morning, softening the edges of hills and trees into shapes that seemed more imagined than real. Afternoon sun warmed her shoulders, casting shadows that lengthened and shrank with the passage of time. Rain occasionally fell in gentle sheets, washing dust from the road and leaving behind the scent of damp earth. Each change reminded Joan that the world moved independently of her intentions, yet it offered lessons in resilience and adaptation, subtly preparing her for the unpredictable court she was to approach. By the end of each day, she found shelter in small inns, barns, or under the sparse protection of trees. These pauses were moments of reflection, where she could process the day's observations and integrate them into her understanding of the journey's purpose. Evenings were quiet and meditative, marked by the soft glow of firelight, the occasional conversation with those she met, and the rhythmic sounds of the natural world as night claimed the land. In these hours, anticipation built slowly, a gentle tension that did not disturb the calm, but encouraged alertness and mindfulness. The river crossings and hill climbs provided more than physical challenges, they offered time for contemplation. As Joan paused to drink from a clear stream or rest against the trunk of a sturdy oak, she reflected on the significance of the task before her. The Dauphin awaited, and with him, the chance to move from the periphery of history toward its center. The uncertainty of reception, the potential for disbelief or dismissal, created a quiet suspense that accompanied her steps without overwhelming them. Each mile traversed was a small act of commitment, reinforcing her readiness to answer the call she had begun to hear long ago. By the time she neared the edges of larger towns, the roads became busier, and the structures more imposing. Stone walls, bridges, and small fortified gates marked the approach to centers of governance and influence. Joan observed each detail with careful attention, noting both the beauty and the discipline inherent in such construction. The contrast between these man-made structures and the natural landscapes she had left behind underscored the journey's significance, a movement from simplicity toward complexity, from private preparation to public responsibility. Throughout the journey, Joan's inner life remained intertwined with the external world. She found meaning in small observations, the flight of a bird, the pattern of sunlight on a hill, the way a stream curved around rocks. These experiences reminded her that presence and attention were as important as courage or obedience. The path to the Dauphin was not merely a physical undertaking, it was an extension of the inner discipline that had been developing quietly within her since childhood. The journey itself became a form of preparation, each mile reinforcing patience, observation, and the capacity to face the unknown. By the time the landscape shifted toward the approaches of courtly life, Joan's mind had adapted to the rhythm of movement and reflection. The long hours of travel, the subtle lessons in observation, and the careful negotiation of uncertainty had brought her to a place where anticipation could be held without panic. She was aware that the Dauphin awaited her, that her presence might be questioned or doubted, yet she carried a quiet readiness. The road had taught her endurance, awareness, and subtle courage, shaping both her understanding of the world and her capacity to engage with it. And as the first signs of the court appeared on the horizon, she stepped forward with the calm, measured resolve that had been cultivated throughout the long, meditative journey from Domrémy. The first glimpse of the court brought with it a sense of scale Joan had never encountered before. Stone walls rose higher than any building in Domrémy, corridors stretched into quiet, shadowed spaces, and tapestries hung along walls that whispered of wealth, power, and history. She stepped into this environment not with the boldness of a conqueror, but with the cautious curiosity of a traveler who had journeyed far and carried with her the steady rhythms of observation and reflection she had cultivated along the road. Here, the world beyond the village unfolded in all its complexity, and Joan was acutely aware of the contrast between the simplicity she had left behind and the structure of authority that now enveloped her. The Dauphin's court was not hostile, but it was formal and measured. People moved with purpose, their eyes noting every arrival, their expressions controlled, revealing little to those unfamiliar with the language of privilege and command. For Joan, the difference between the ordinary life she had known and this environment created a subtle tension, not fear, but alertness. Every gesture, every word, carried significance. She understood that she was being observed in ways that extended beyond her immediate presence, that her actions might be weighed, interpreted, and tested by those for whom protocol and tradition were as natural as breathing. Her first encounters with the court's clergy and advisers were marked by careful attention. Questions were posed, not with aggression, but with the formality and deliberation of authority. They spoke of visions, of divine guidance, of purpose, and of her understanding of what she claimed to hear. Joan answered simply, with clarity and sincerity. She did not embellish, nor did she anticipate the answers her listeners might prefer. Each response was measured, reflecting both her understanding and the quiet confidence that had been developing within her. The weight of the court's scrutiny was real, yet she met it with a composed humility. Doubt hovered in the air around her, though it was subtle. Some questioned her age, her gender, or her experience, others wondered if the messages she claimed were truly from divine sources. Yet the challenge was never confrontational. It existed in the contrasts between expectation and demonstration, between what was assumed and what was presented. Joan's role was to embody her truth calmly, letting her consistency speak louder than argument. In doing so, she learned a form of resilience that required neither force nor defiance, only steadfast presence. Observation became as crucial as speech. Joan noticed the smallest cues, the shift in an advisor's gaze, the slight tension in a cleric's hands, the deliberate pacing of those who spoke before her. Each detail informed her responses, helping her navigate an environment designed to test more than simply knowledge. She had been trained by years of attentiveness, and now that training found its purpose. Every question, every pause, became an opportunity to demonstrate her calm focus and the quiet strength that had been nurtured along her journey. In these moments, the atmosphere itself was a teacher. The court was a place of ritual and repetition, where protocol guided behavior and authority shaped perception. Joan learned to move within its constraints, understanding that power could be observed without being mimicked, respected without being feared. The contrast between her village upbringing and the formalities of the court heightened her awareness of responsibility. She realized that credibility was not granted by position but earned through consistency and integrity, even in the presence of scrutiny. The clergy, for their part, presented a complex mixture of inquiry and assessment. They asked about her faith, her understanding of Scripture, and the nature of her visions. Their questions were deliberate, probing the depth of her knowledge while maintaining an even, measured tone. Joan responded with honesty, neither embellishing nor retreating. Her ability to answer calmly, grounded in the quiet confidence of her preparation, began to earn the subtle recognition of those who observed her. Validation, when it came, was unspoken at first, a nod of approval, a gentle change in posture, a softening of the eyes that indicated understanding without fanfare. What defined this stage of Joan's journey was less the content of the questions and more the manner in which she carried herself. She did not attempt to dominate the conversation or assert authority beyond what was required. Instead, she allowed her clarity, her sincerity, and her unwavering attention to guide the impression she made. In this way, she cultivated a quiet credibility, one that required no dramatic gestures but spoke of inner strength. Those who listened could sense the weight of her presence and the steadiness of her purpose, even if the words themselves were simple. Throughout the examinations, Joan navigated an unspoken balance. She remained fully present, aware of the importance of her words and the potential for misinterpretation, yet she did not allow the environment to overwhelm her. There was no haste, no need to assert herself aggressively. Instead, patience and careful attentiveness became her allies. Each response, each pause, was measured, demonstrating both respect for authority and confidence in her own understanding. The subtle interplay between humility and clarity created a resonance that few in the court could ignore. By the end of her assessments, Joan had begun to establish her place within this unfamiliar world. The court, accustomed to routine and protocol, recognized in her a steadfastness that transcended age and background. She was a presence both delicate and firm, capable of withstanding scrutiny without losing the quiet composure that had defined her life. In this way, she earned more than temporary acknowledgement. She began to cultivate the credibility that would allow her to influence events far beyond Domrémy. As the hours of examination passed, a rhythm settled over the interactions. Questions followed by reflection, observation followed by measured response, the contrast between authority and humility maintained without conflict. Joan moved within this rhythm with growing confidence, each exchange reinforcing her understanding of how to navigate a world defined by scrutiny and expectation. The court had tested her, not with confrontation, but with attentive observation, and in meeting that challenge, she strengthened the foundation of resilience that would carry her forward. When the day concluded, Joan withdrew from the direct attention of the court and allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. She considered the path that had brought her here, the journey through villages and forests, the patient listening that had been her companion, the internal discipline that had been cultivated in the rhythms of Domrémy. Each step, each moment of attentiveness, had prepared her for this. Though the road ahead remained uncertain, the court had confirmed that she could meet the demands of scrutiny with grace and steadiness. In the quiet aftermath, she carried with her a growing awareness of inner strength, the calm readiness to face the challenges yet to come, and the gentle understanding that courage often manifests in quiet, deliberate presence rather than in outward force. The news of the siege at Orleans reached Joan as a distant murmur, carried on the lips of travelers and couriers. The city, hemmed in by enemy forces, was said to stand on the brink of despair. For many, it had become a place defined by anxiety and doubt, a city whose people measured days not in sunlight or harvest, but in the ebb of fear and the uncertainty of what might come. Yet, in Joan's heart, there was a quiet understanding. Her role would not be measured in force or strategy alone, but in the subtle power of morale, in the courage and belief she could awaken in those who had begun to lose both. When she arrived at the city gates, the atmosphere was heavy yet expectant. Soldiers moved with weary precision, their steps measured by routines that had once been simple but now carried the weight of urgency. Citizens whispered behind shuttered windows, glancing at the banners that signaled the presence of hope without yet understanding its shape. Joan observed carefully, noting the tension in shoulders, the hesitancy in glances, and the subtle ways that prolonged stress had altered familiar human patterns. She did not rush forward with commands. Instead, she allowed her presence to radiate calm and assurance, a quiet reminder that action was guided by purpose rather than panic. Her role became clear through simple, deliberate gestures. She encouraged soldiers to maintain their vigilance, not through demands, but through example and attentive observation. When men faltered, she offered words that were gentle yet unwavering, reinforcing the sense that their efforts mattered. Hope, she understood, was not shouted into existence, it was cultivated, nurtured, and embodied in small, consistent acts. Each conversation, each encouragement, became part of a larger tapestry of belief that slowly began to shift the mood of the city. The symbolism of her presence carried weight beyond her words. She moved among the ranks with humility, yet her demeanor suggested a connection to something larger than herself. Soldiers and citizens alike could sense that she was not merely another messenger or observer, but a figure whose calm composure and attentive presence held significance. This recognition was subtle, more felt than articulated, and it reinforced the quiet transformation she was fostering. In a world weighed down by fear and uncertainty, she embodied steadiness, determination, and the possibility of change. At key moments, she offered guidance that was measured, never forceful. Her instructions were simple, rooted in practicality, yet framed by a sense of purpose that inspired trust. She advised where observation and patience might be as crucial as immediate action, emphasizing the importance of collective responsibility over individual heroism. By focusing on what could be controlled, rather than the chaos of circumstance, she helped channel energy toward productive action. The siege, once a source of despair, became a challenge that could be faced with attention, discipline, and unity. Beyond immediate tasks, Joan's presence began to influence the morale of the city in subtle ways. People who had grown accustomed to doubt began to notice the calm in her eyes, the steadiness of her demeanor, and the quiet determination she carried into each interaction. This influence did not arrive dramatically, it unfolded gradually, like light breaking across a fogged landscape. The belief that someone beyond the immediate pressures of conflict had faith in their capacity stirred the hearts of those who had begun to feel forgotten or powerless. Her role was as much psychological as practical, reinforcing the sense that hope could persist even in shadowed circumstances. Citizens and soldiers alike responded not with immediate transformation, but with incremental shifts. Hesitancy became action, doubt became quiet confidence, and fatigue was met with renewed attention to duty. Joan's ability to observe, guide, and inspire without dominance created an atmosphere in which collective belief could flourish. In a city strained by siege, where despair had threatened to seep into every corner, her presence acted as a stabilizing force, reminding all who encountered her that they were part of something larger than individual fear or limitation. The importance of symbolic leadership became apparent during communal activities, such as preparation of defenses, coordination of supplies, and the careful maintenance of morale. Joan's engagement was measured, deliberate, and consistent, emphasizing unity and shared responsibility. She did not seek accolades or recognition, she sought only to embody calm determination and foster belief. In doing so, she allowed the citizens and soldiers to experience agency within constrained circumstances, reinforcing the notion that even small, thoughtful actions could shift the balance between hope and despair. The days of the siege unfolded with a rhythm marked by both tension and attentiveness. Joan moved through this rhythm with growing ease, observing, reflecting, and offering guidance where it mattered most. She became a bridge between the weary city and the possibility of renewal, a focal point for collective focus and aspiration. Through her, the abstract concept of courage became tangible, lived in measured steps, careful decisions, and the steady pulse of attention. Those around her began to sense that the siege was not an insurmountable obstacle, but a challenge that could be approached with resolve and care. Stories of her presence, while subtle, began to circulate. Not as legends of conquest, but as accounts of encouragement, presence, and calm influence. People spoke of the way she moved through the city, the quiet authority she embodied, and the reassurance that followed her steps. These stories reinforced the symbolic weight of her actions, creating a shared understanding that morale and belief could hold as much power as swords and strategies. In a world shaped by uncertainty and fear, such recognition carried profound significance. By the time relief efforts began to shift the tide, the city's mood had transformed in small but critical ways. Confidence had returned, measured and cautious, yet persistent. Soldiers who had once doubted their strength acted with greater coordination, citizens, previously paralyzed by worry, contributed to communal efforts with renewed attention. Joan's role, framed by patience, presence, and subtle influence, had become inseparable from the collective experience. The siege, once defined by anxiety, now contained moments of optimism, hope, and shared purpose. Through this period, Joan's character was illuminated not by dramatic deeds, but by the quiet cultivation of morale, the steady presence that inspired belief, and the symbolic leadership that reminded all who encountered her that hope could endure even in constrained circumstances. The Maid of Orleans emerged not merely as a figure of legend, but as a living embodiment of quiet courage and attentiveness, demonstrating that meaningful action often begins with observation, reflection, and a steady, deliberate nurturing of belief in others. In this way, the city's survival became intertwined with her presence, and the foundation for her enduring story was laid, not in the chaos of battle, but in the calm insistence of hope realized through care, attentiveness, and shared purpose. Even as Orleans celebrated the easing of the siege, Joan felt the first subtle stirrings of a different reality, one not of triumph, but of change. Victory brought relief to the city, yet it also shifted the currents of attention and power in ways she could not control. The cheers and gratitude of the people, once constant and sustaining, began to soften as the exigencies of governance and politics took precedence. The calm that had accompanied her rise was giving way to the quieter, more complex rhythms of influence and expectation. The court, once attentive to her presence, began to reorient toward traditional channels of power. Nobles and clergy, who had once observed her guidance with cautious approval, now engaged in subtle negotiations among themselves, recalibrating alliances and interests in the wake of the city's relief. Joan noticed these shifts not through confrontation or hostility, but in the small gestures, the pauses in conversation, and the moments when her counsel was acknowledged only superficially. The world she had entered, which once seemed to bend around a shared sense of purpose, now returned to its habitual structures of authority. Her supporters, those who had carried hope in their hearts because of her presence, gradually faced the demands of renewed responsibilities. Soldiers who had once followed her attentively were recalled to garrisons, and citizens who had looked to her for inspiration returned to the steady routines of daily life. The energy that had surrounded her began to dissipate like mist at sunrise, leaving her in a quieter, more reflective space. The very hope she had cultivated now highlighted her singularity. She remained constant, even as the world around her shifted and moved on. Joan's own perception of events was framed by patience and observation, but it carried a growing awareness of impermanence. She had learned that influence could not always be sustained by presence alone, and that the loyalty of others often depended on circumstances as much as conviction. Her victories, though meaningful, were temporal. The city had been lifted, but the structures of power, fear, and politics persisted. She could sense, in the gestures and tones of those around her, that her role was being subtly redefined, and that the clarity of purpose she had known was becoming more complicated. Isolation crept quietly into her days. It was not dramatic or harsh, it was a gentle, persistent separation from the shared attention that had once grounded her. Meetings that had previously included her input now proceeded with only cursory acknowledgement. Decisions, once guided in part by her perspective, were increasingly shaped by advisors and officials who relied on precedent and protocol rather than insight or intuition. She remained physically present, yet her influence, so palpable in earlier moments, became measured and intermittent. This solitude was compounded by the shift in perception toward her age and gender. The initial wonder that had accompanied her arrival, admiration tinged with awe, began to mingle with doubt and skepticism. Some questioned her capacity to sustain leadership, to navigate the subtleties of politics, or to command respect beyond a moment of crisis. These reflections were seldom voiced openly, but Joan perceived them nonetheless. Her keen observation, once a tool for building connection and confidence, now illuminated the distance forming between herself and those whose approval she had valued. The emotional landscape of isolation was subtle, shaped by contrasts rather than extremes. She could still recognize moments of support and admiration, yet they were infrequent and fleeting. The consistency she had embodied in Orleans now existed alongside an awareness that others' attention, once directed by collective anxiety or hope, could easily be diverted by circumstance. The impermanence of influence, the shifting priorities of those around her, and the slow erosion of shared focus created a quiet melancholy that threaded through her days. Even within this gradual estrangement, Joan's inner life remained steady. Her faith and attentiveness, honed over years of listening and reflection, became sources of resilience. She understood that isolation did not equate to failure, nor did it diminish the significance of her earlier contributions. Yet the subtle sadness of being set apart, of remaining engaged while others moved on, marked the beginning of a new chapter, one less filled with outward recognition, more defined by internal discipline and quiet perseverance. Political currents shifted in ways that were both visible and imperceptible. Councils convened, letters exchanged, and alliances adjusted behind closed doors, all while the outward manifestations of gratitude and acknowledgement receded. Joan's presence, once central to morale and belief, was now observed in passing, acknowledged politely, but no longer shaping outcomes in the same immediate way. The rhythm of her influence had softened, and with it came the awareness that her journey through attention and support was as transient as it was remarkable. In these moments, Joan reflected upon the nature of accomplishment and its fragility. She had moved a city, inspired belief, and altered the course of events, yet the world structure remained largely unchanged. The impermanence of external validation highlighted the enduring importance of internal fortitude. Her victories were not defined solely by recognition or praise, but by the quiet, lasting impact she had fostered within individuals and communities. The contrast between external acknowledgement and inner certainty became a subtle but profound lesson, shaping her understanding of what it meant to act with purpose. By the end of this period, the contours of Joan's isolation had settled into a steady, reflective space. The jubilation of Orleans had faded, the attention of the court had shifted, and the city's inhabitants had returned to their routines. Joan remained present, engaged, and attentive, yet the solitary nature of her position was unmistakable. The gentle melancholy that accompanied this transition was not bitterness or despair, but a quiet acknowledgement of impermanence, a recognition that even the most meaningful achievements exist within the ebb and flow of time and circumstance. In this way, Joan's journey moved from the collective triumph of shared hope to the introspective reality of solitude. The emotional descent was gradual, framed not by dramatic loss, but by subtle shifts in attention, authority, and expectation. It was a quiet, contemplative space, where reflection deepened and resilience took root. And as the world continued to move around her, she carried forward the lessons of endurance, the awareness of impermanence, and the understanding that true strength often exists in the steady, unobserved persistence of purpose, even when recognition fades. The calm of the early months following Orleans was not to last. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the forces of circumstance began to close in on Joan. She had become a figure of influence, and influence in a world governed by power and politics often invites challenge. The siege's immediate crisis had passed, and with it, the collective urgency that had allowed her presence to hold sway diminished. It was in this quieter landscape that danger, subtle yet inevitable, found its path toward her. The first whispers of capture drifted like a distant wind, unheard by many, yet unmistakable to the one who had learned to listen closely to the world around her. When she was taken, the event itself was not marked by violence or dramatic confrontation. She was surrounded, guided away from familiar surroundings, and escorted under watchful eyes. The process was orderly, controlled, and suffused with a bureaucratic inevitability that contrasted sharply with the urgency and energy of her earlier triumphs. Even in her removal, the quiet dignity she carried did not waver. She moved steadily, with a composure born of years of attentive preparation and patient reflection. The journey into captivity was not a sudden rupture but a slow transition, each step reminding her that the external world could shift without warning, regardless of one's intentions or deeds. In captivity, the days were marked by waiting and observation. Joan, accustomed to the rhythm of duties and interactions, found herself in a space defined by stillness and restriction. Walls that were unfamiliar, rooms that were silent, and the careful attentions of guards created an environment that was both confining and contemplative. There was no dramatized threat, no need for fear to take hold. Instead, she faced the subtle weight of constraint, an awareness of circumstance that required patience and calm endurance. In this environment, she observed as much as she reflected, noting the behaviors, gestures, and unspoken communications of those around her. Her trial was conducted with a similar measured formality. Questions were posed regarding her faith, her visions, and her actions. The atmosphere was not designed to terrify, though it carried the gravity of judgment. Joan responded with clarity, humility, and unwavering adherence to the truth she knew. She did not argue or exaggerate, she spoke plainly, reflecting a steadiness that had been cultivated through years of listening, observation, and reflection. The process tested not only her understanding of herself but also the depth of her composure, the ability to navigate authority without yielding the core of her integrity. Throughout the trial, the presence of authority was palpable. Judges and clerics, seated with deliberate posture and measured expression, asked questions that probed her knowledge, her motives, and her claims of divine guidance. Joan answered consistently, maintaining calm even as the scrutiny intensified. Her demeanor highlighted the contrast between external authority and internal certainty, showing that influence could persist even in environments designed to diminish it. Each exchange reinforced the quiet dignity of her presence and the resilience that had been nurtured over years of attentive living and measured action. Isolation during this period was profound yet subtle. Those who had once surrounded her with shared belief or attention were distant, constrained by circumstance, fear, or political calculation. The solitude was not dramatic, it was gentle, a quiet space in which reflection deepened. Joan could observe the ways in which power operated, noting how the structures around her weighed tradition against the unfamiliar, how fear and protocol often replaced understanding and insight. In this observation, she cultivated patience, understanding that endurance in stillness could be as meaningful as action in motion. Her captors maintained a routine of careful supervision, yet within the constraints of their observation, Joan's presence remained unshaken. She continued to reflect on the broader significance of her journey, recognizing that trials, like victories, were moments that revealed the character of those involved as much as the events themselves. The subtle injustice she faced did not provoke outrage but invoked contemplation, a recognition of the complexity of human motivations, the interplay of circumstance, and the limits of authority. Calm sorrow, tempered by awareness, became the companion of her days. In quiet moments, she drew upon the discipline cultivated through years of listening to voices both literal and inner. Reflection on her earlier journey, the fields of Domrémy, the roads that led to Orleans, the courts that tested her resolve, provided a scaffold for understanding her present circumstance. Each memory served as a reminder of endurance, of measured courage, and of the ways in which presence and consistency could hold significance even in environments seemingly designed to minimize it. The trial became less a matter of confrontation than a stage for observation and quiet demonstration of integrity. The process of questioning often circled familiar themes: the origin of her guidance, her understanding of Scripture, her motivations, and her knowledge of military and political matters. Each question, though serious, was met with deliberate attention and measured response. Joan's words were calm and consistent, reflecting not only personal conviction but a deep awareness of the moral and spiritual dimensions of her circumstances. She allowed the weight of her integrity to speak more loudly than argument, demonstrating the quiet power of steadfastness in the face of scrutiny. Through this period, the subtle melancholy of isolation and observation grew into a profound contemplation of human impermanence. The structures of authority, while rigid and formal, revealed the limitations of human judgment. Joan's endurance highlighted the contrast between temporal power and the constancy of purpose and faith. In this reflection, a gentle moral clarity emerged: even when the world judges unfairly, the alignment of action with conscience and understanding remains a source of quiet strength and dignity. By the end of these proceedings, Joan had navigated an environment filled with authority, scrutiny, and subtle social isolation without compromising the integrity of her purpose. The trial, conducted slowly and formally, left her position not only as a subject of history but as a figure of reflection for those who observed her courage. There was no need for dramatization of suffering; the quiet weight of circumstance, combined with her calm, attentive presence, sufficed to convey the gravity of events and the depth of her resilience. In the subdued rhythm of captivity and trial, Joan embodied patience, moral clarity, and quiet fortitude. The world around her, governed by shifting authority and cautious protocol, moved with measured steps, yet within her remained a steady inner life. It was a period of gentle reflection, where sorrow and awareness intertwined, where injustice could be perceived without succumbing to despair, and where the enduring power of attentiveness, humility, and integrity became evident. Even as the circumstances foreshadowed challenges yet to come, Joan's calm presence transformed the trial into a testament to the quiet, enduring strength of one who listens, observes, and carries purpose steadily, regardless of recognition or reward. The day that marked the culmination of Joan's earthly journey arrived quietly, with a sense of inevitability that had been accumulating over months of reflection, observation, and patient endurance. She walked toward it with the same composed determination that had characterized every step of her path, through the fields of Domrémy, across roads long and winding, through courts and cities, and within the solemn confines of captivity. The world around her, ever attentive to ceremony and protocol, moved with the measured steps of authority and expectation, yet Joan's inner life remained profoundly calm. She carried with her a sense of purpose that transcended immediate circumstance, a quiet connection to the guidance that had first called to her in the stillness of childhood. As she faced her final moments, the atmosphere was subdued, reflective rather than dramatic. Flames, ritual, and words of judgment surrounded her, yet they did not define the entirety of her experience. In her mind, she traced the contours of the life she had led, the familiar rhythms of her village home, the careful steps along dusty roads, the faces of those she had inspired, and the steady pulse of faith that had carried her from uncertainty to purpose. Each memory was a thread in a tapestry that extended beyond the temporal, weaving together the ordinary and extraordinary, the quiet and the profound. There was no fear in her composure, nor was there a need to dramatize the moment. Her focus remained on the essence of her calling, the voices that had guided her, the inner clarity that had shaped her actions, and the steadfastness that had allowed her to navigate scrutiny, doubt, and challenge. The fire, though real and immediate, was but a detail within a larger, enduring narrative, a passage from temporal experience into a realm of remembrance and meaning. The calm acceptance she embodied transformed what might have been chaos into a space of spiritual stillness, a pause in which reflection could unfold naturally. Her death, though sorrowful for those who witnessed it, was also a quiet affirmation of constancy. Joan's life had been defined not by the absence of difficulty, but by the integration of courage, patience, and integrity into every circumstance. Those who observed her final moments could sense that she moved beyond the reach of temporal concerns, that the essence of her being remained connected to a purpose that extended far beyond the immediate events of the day. In this transcendence, there was a kind of peace that was felt rather than spoken, a calm that seeped into the hearts of witnesses, inviting reflection and quiet understanding. In the years that followed, her memory endured and transformed. The narrative of her life, once subject to the judgments and limitations of politics, slowly shifted into the domain of legend and reflection. Sainthood, recognition, and symbolic resonance emerged as expressions of the lasting impact she had cultivated. People recounted her deeds not merely as historical events but as reminders of the power of belief, integrity, and steadfast attention. Her journey, from the quiet village of Domrémy to the heart of France's struggle, became a template for contemplation, illustrating how courage and purpose can manifest in measured, attentive ways. The legacy of Joan was also embedded in the stories told across generations. These narratives emphasized her humility as much as her heroism, her capacity for observation as much as her decisive action. The symbolism of her presence, the maid who heard the call, remained intact, inviting reflection on the ways in which ordinary lives intersect with extraordinary opportunity. In recounting her life, communities found a model for sustaining hope, nurturing belief, and embracing the quiet endurance required when circumstances seemed beyond comprehension. Her sainthood, though formalized long after her passing, reflected the deeper resonance of her choices and character. The canonization process acknowledged not only acts of historical significance but also the spiritual and moral clarity she embodied. In this recognition, there was a universal lesson, that steadfast attention to inner guidance, integrity in action, and patience amid uncertainty can create echoes that extend beyond temporal life. It is a reminder that influence need not be loud or violent to endure. Sometimes, it is the quiet, consistent presence that shapes memory and inspires reflection across centuries. The contrast between the small village she left and the enduring reverence she inspired is striking. Domrémy, once a cradle of simplicity, became the origin of a story that spanned lands and generations. Each observer, from the soldiers she inspired to the scholars and believers who chronicled her life, participated in the ongoing dialogue of remembrance. The ordinary and the extraordinary coexisted, teaching that human experience carries weight not only in action but in the integrity and mindfulness that underlie those actions. Even the imagery of fire, often associated with destruction or end, becomes in this context a symbol of transformation. It marked the passage of one stage of existence into another, a gentle reminder that endings are often beginnings in disguise. The narrative, once contained in immediate circumstances, expanded into the larger canvas of memory, legend, and spiritual reflection. Each retelling reinforced the enduring values Joan embodied: patience, attentiveness, courage, humility, and the quiet pursuit of purpose even in the face of impermanence. In reflecting on her life, one sees the persistence of continuity within change. She moved through doubt and fear, embraced responsibility, inspired collective belief, endured scrutiny and isolation, and ultimately passed from the temporal world with grace and composure. The arc of her journey illustrates the interplay between circumstance and character, between the ephemeral and the eternal. Her story encourages the listener to recognize that purpose and courage do not require the absence of difficulty, only the willingness to act with integrity and attentiveness within it. Even centuries later, the call that guided her resonates as a symbol rather than a literal command. It represents the quiet promptings within each person toward integrity, responsibility, and courage. Listeners, even as they drift toward sleep, can imagine that call echoing gently, inviting reflection, calm engagement, and the understanding that a single life, lived with attentive purpose, can leave a legacy that transcends circumstance, time, and place. The cadence of her choices, the measured rhythm of action and reflection, offers a template for stillness within motion, awareness within challenge, and peace within transformation. The lasting image is one of transcendence and calm. Joan, though removed from the world of her village and the turbulence of politics, becomes a symbol of enduring virtue. Her life illustrates that influence and legacy do not always manifest through spectacle or dramatic confrontation, but through the consistent cultivation of attention, courage, and integrity. In this way, her story closes gently, with the listener invited into reflection, quiet meditation, and a sense of spiritual continuity that extends beyond the immediate narrative of events. As the final moments of her life blend into memory and legend, the emotional tone settles into a quiet, sleep-ready stillness. There is melancholy, yes, but it is tempered by reflection and understanding. There is sorrow, but it is joined by transcendence and calm. The listener is invited to dwell not on loss alone, but on the enduring resonance of character, courage, and attentive purpose. In this gentle conclusion, Joan's life becomes more than history, it becomes a guide for contemplation, a quiet source of inspiration, and an echo of the call that began in a small, still village, reverberating across time, space, and the human heart. Through fire, silence, and legacy, the journey completes its arc, offering a calm and reflective closure that honors the life, influence, and enduring presence of Joan of Arc. In this way, the listener is carried gently into a state of serene reflection, the narrative's rhythm slow and measured, leaving behind only the quiet echo of courage, faith, and purpose, a sound that lingers softly, as if whispered in the mind long after the story ends. If Joan's journey inspired you tonight, gently tap like to let me know, and consider subscribing for more stories that carry you through history, one quiet night at a time. Share this story with someone who loves history, they might drift into sleep with Joan's calm courage tonight.